The Springbok consensus tells us that the national rugby team's performances are good for the economy. They're good for the economy because winning games like the quarterfinal against France leads to productivity and social cohesion. But might the opposite not be the case? Might the Springboks not just exhaust us, causing us to be lazy and indigent? In this podcast, I take a satirical look at the downside of being a supporter of the men in green and gold, whether they're playing a World Cup quarterfinal against France or a semi-final against England. Welcome to the Luke Alfred Show. I have 30 years of experience on the front lines of sports journalism, covering some of the biggest games in cricket, rugby, the FIFA World Cup, and even the Olympic Games. Come and join me as we learn about some of the greatest sports stories you've never heard. I'm Luke Alfred, and welcome to the show. From a common sense point of view, we assume that the Springboks are good for the economy. We assume that they're good for that hoary old chestnut nation building, a phrase we sort of understand, but finally, I suspect, we don't really understand at all. Lastly, we assume that in some difficult to quantify way, the Springboks are good for us, our well-being, and, to coin a cheeky phrase under the circumstances, our joie de vivre. After Sunday night's one-point quarter-final win against France in Paris, a win that surely shaved days, if not months, off the nation's collective life expectancy, I'm not so sure. The argument that the Boks are good for us and the economy goes roughly like this. Months from a major tournament like the World Cup, Bok fans experience a kind of pre-expectation. This is a gentle, timidly curious emotion akin to the mild feeling of wondering what's over the next rise when driving across rolling hills, listening to Van Morrison or Bob Dylan, or even, if you're an unreconstructed hipster like me, the new darling of country, Gillian Welch. In time, pre-expectation gives way to expectation proper. This usually coincides, at least in part, with something tangible, like the official release of a tournament schedule. With the release of the tournament schedule, you can really begin to look forward to something. You can begin to plan your life, skillfully avoiding that wedding you don't really want to go to because, yes, let's see, the Springboks are playing Romania that afternoon, where they will take the piss and allow Faf to play at fly half for a bit. After using the tournament schedule to plan what you might like to avoid, you can also use the tournament schedule to plan what you might like not to avoid. This results in a deepening of expectation. You think to yourself, the match against Scotland, that looks tasty, and the later clash against Ireland, that looks juicier still. You don't only plan your leisure activities around the schedule becomes incorporated into your working life. You plan the business trip to Ghana before the advent of the tournament proper. On a more mundane level, the prospect of the Boks doing well at the World Cup helps you get through work. It might even marginally increase your productivity. The very thought of what Cheslin might actually do if found one-on-one with Damien Penaud in broken play is enough to help anyone accurately populate an Excel spreadsheet. In this way, you find that you work better before matches, working as you do in your bubble of expectation. And you work better after matches too, particularly if the Boks have won the previous weekend. If they have won, everybody's chirpy, everyone's chatty, they all have a word, or an anecdote, or a reflection. It's great in the moment, and it's great because if the win has allowed them to stay in the tournament, you can go through the pre-expectation cycle all over again. Sometimes that's fun in itself. Admittedly, it's not as fun as actually beating France, but expectation very definitely has its own structure of fun. You can have fun just imagining what you'll be feeling after you do actually beat them, in front of all of their fans and the cauldron of savagery in North Paris. So goes the theory. But what if it isn't like this at all? What if winning doesn't help you to work? What if it does just the opposite? What if winning makes it impossible to work? Remember, The halftime score in the France quarter-final was 22-19 to France. The first half contained 6 tries, 6 exhausting tries that exhausted you well into the next day. But at least the first half followed some pattern. It was a helter-skelter pattern, to and fro, yes, but at least a pattern could be discerned. There was the pattern, for instance, of Antoine Dupont bossing things from scrum half in the way that an old-fashioned fly half used to do. Dupont is so figuratively large that he plays at 9 and 10 all by himself. We think traditionally of scrum halves as hinges, linking the frame of the pack to the door of the backs. This is what a classic, almost old-fashioned scrum half like Munster and Ireland's Conor Murray does. But Dupont isn't like this. He's an instigator and a sniper, a creator, as his coach Fabien Galtier was. He instigated France's second try with France foraging deep in South Africa's half. With the referee Ben O'Keefe judging Steven Kitsoff offside, Dupont summed up the situation and flung a long pass out to hooker Peter Movaka, who barreled over while the Boks was still reflecting on how it was they conceded the first try. For all of Dupont's jack-in-the-box-like qualities, it makes one wonder what it's like to be Mathieu Jalibert, the French fly half. With Dupont as a 2-in-1 player, Jalibert must feel surplus to requirements, the younger brother who has nagged his way to the party because he wants to be friends with his older brother's friends, friends who aren't really bothered to be friends with him at all. Jalibert must think sometimes that he's a refugee, a veritable Algerian, or Syrian, or Ukrainian, waiting for his papers. There was obvious pattern too from the Bok point of view of Boks and Damien Willemse's towering diagonal kicks onto the French wingers, with Pieter-Steph du Toit lurking in amongst them like a lion in a dazzle of very nervous zebra. Looking at the replay suggests that this is only half of the story, however, particularly when it came to South Africa's second try. The French players who failed to control the ball after Boks' diagonal weren't their wingers. No, sir. Rather, it was rangy lock Cameron Woki, who allowed the ball to pop about like an inflatable toy in the air above the Wanderers' grandstand on a slow test afternoon in which Dean Elgar has scored 37 in 104 balls. Woki initially knocked it forward. As he tried to rectify his mistake, he knocked it backwards into Damien Dialende's hands. Dialende barreled downfield on those strangely short and busy caterpillar-like legs of his. He couldn't believe his luck. It's as if he had just been given a tax rebate before being scragged. Herring up on his shoulder, Du Toit picked and drove before he was hauled down by Charles Olivon, the French flanker, inches from the line. The ball was recycled and Kobus Reinach delayed his pass momentarily before passing the ball to Dialende, who dived over. Du Toit was very good here, giving the move thrust when it might have died. His pickup was perfect, reminding me of the try he scored against the All Blacks in the match between the two teams in the World Cup 4 years ago. You might mutter that such pickups are meat and drink for a player of Du Toit's pedigree, but the pickup still needed to be picked up, and we needed to pick up the pickup if we were to get a rounded appreciation of what Du Toit, so often unseen, means to the Springbok side and how it functions. So yes, there was a pattern to divine in the first half, frenetic as it was, but the second half was full of no pattern at all, which was not only tiring but tiresome. It was tiring not only because there was no pattern, but because, crucially, nothing actually happened, points-wise that is, as the second half ended up being a different match. It was a test within a test, one that ended up with the score 10-6 in favour of the Springboks. For 14 minutes at the start of the second half there was no scoring until Thomas Ramos, the French full-back, scored a 54th minute penalty to add 3 points to the home team's 22-19 half-time lead to make it 25-19 to France. The score stayed stuck at 25-19 for a full further 13 minutes until Eben Etzebeth's try in the 67th minute, which was converted by Pollard to put the Boks into a 1-point lead, 25-26. When the scoreboard isn't moving in a crucial test match, it makes the teams jittery. They are, of course, jittery because they aren't scoring points, but they're also jittery because nothing seems to be happening but for a winding down of the clock, which, of course, adds depth to their original jitteriness. With all these chronological and temporal references ticking away like a rhetorical time bomb, there's no need to hold back. So let's just stop the clock for a moment. Let's have a little pause, as they did when it was still summer in France and everyone needed a mid-half drinks break, and take a deep breath. While we pause, we can reflect. We can admit that it's not strictly true to say that nothing was happening in the second half. Things were happening as the second half progressed, but they were frequently the wrong things. It would be interesting to make a long list of the wrong things going wrong as far as the teams were concerned, but off the top of my head, let me just make a short list. 1. On 45 minutes, Pfaff de Klerk replaced Reinach, and pretty much everything went wrong for Pfaff to begin with, including the fact that he came on in the first place. 2. One of the first wrong things to happen to Pfaff, compounding the initial mistake of coming on in the first place, was that he was skinned by DuPont on the blind side, something which might have caused Pfaff to reflect on why he'd been brought on at all. 3. On 51 minutes, Ox and Chair replaced Steven Kitsoff. This allowed Matthew Pearce in the Supersport studio to pronounce Ox's full first name, which is Retshego Faditswe, a name which, given its tricky 16 letters, is nearly as big as the man himself. Calling an ox is clearly not good enough for the virtue-signaling Pearce, who does this every time Ox comes on. Pearce clearly wants to go all triple word score on us. 4. Bongi Mbonambi knocked on. 5. Leroux also knocked on after a too cute back-of-the-hand pass from Dialende. Afterwards, he muttered under his breath. This, you'll admit, is classic Willie. What would a Springbok side be without Stroppy Willie? He's like a character in a sitcom. He's like the uncle from Somerset West, who complains when he's not invited to Christmas, but leaves early when he is. Willie's worth to the side is not measured in tries or skip passes or relieving left-footed kicks. It's measured in mutters. 6. Archie Snyman and Du Toit got in each other's way, as if both were reaching for the same sausage roll at the neighborhood bring and bri. The list could go on, but I promised you a short list, so a short list it remains, except that for 7, which I couldn't resist, because it concerns Pfaff. Round about here, Snyman climbed tall, winning good line-out ball which he, somewhat casually, palmed down into the space where he thought Pfaff would be. Pfaff, however, wasn't there. He was somewhere else. The blue wave broke, and Pfaff was swallowed, and the Boks was suddenly backpedaling at a rate of knots. Lest I be accused of being a self-loathing Springbok supporter, let me say, in the interests of balance and fairness, that things were also going wrong in this period of heightened anxieties for France. Take Jalibert, the French fly-half, who we referenced earlier. It was during this period that Jalibert kicked the ball backwards, a truly astounding achievement. I haven't seen the backwards kick before, and Jalibert did his beautifully. Just imagine, France were looking for some respite. Everyone was looking forwards to roughly where they thought the ball was going to land, and suddenly they realized that it hadn't arrived. Why? Because Jalibert, in an act of assiduous trickery, had kicked the ball backwards, the perfect metaphor for where, we all felt, the game was heading at that crucial stage. To do justice to Jalibert, in the second half he did come out of DuPont's very large and imposing shadow. He made a couple of slinky breaks, and the more Handré Pollard rushed out of defensive alignment in an attempt to crash tackle him, the more he tricked and sidestepped Pollard. Like a bullfighter, he watched Pollard snort haplessly past, as he kicked up dust. It was round about here, before the Springboks' fourth try, that things began to get truly exhausting for those of us watching thousands of kilometers away. The match was on such a knife edge, it was getting so hairy, that it was almost as if you were watching a World Cup quarter-final on the verge of a nervous breakdown. It was as if the entire match was having a panic attack. Poor Hetapon O'Keefe was having a panic attack. The Boks were having a panic attack. The French were having a panic attack. The respective benches were trying very hard not to have a panic attack, but were probably having one all the same. Jalibert, quite clearly, was having his panic attack as he kicked good ball back into the first half, where things were easier and not quite as panic-stricken. A place where things had pattern and, with pattern, meaning. Hell, I don't blame him. The first half was a far more understandable place to be in. There were those, however, who, in the midst of all this panic, didn't panic. Etzebeth didn't panic in scoring the fourth try with half of the French team hanging off his back, and Pollard, after being sidestepped so successfully by Jalibert, didn't panic in nailing that masterful long-range penalty from inside his own half. Kwagga Smith didn't panic in effecting that brilliant turnover, and neither did Dion Fourie. It was great to see them all hold their nerve while the whole rugby world was panicking around them. That they weren't panicking wasn't, of course, quite enough to allay our panic. And were we panicking back at home? Just in case you've forgotten where we started, and this podcast has become a little bit too much like the match it describes, a quick reminder. Let me also remind myself, because I've forgotten too. We started out this podcast questioning the assumption that watching the Springboks at the World Cup is 1. Good for productivity, and 2. Good for national morale and social cohesion. I don't know about you, but I woke up on Monday morning absolutely sleep-deprived. That period in the second half, when the game was clearly going nowhere, exhausted me to such a degree that I spent most of the day being shatteringly unproductive. I know other people were being unproductive too. They were being unproductive because they were talking about the Springboks. When they weren't talking about the Springboks, they were talking about how tired they were. It was utterly exhausting. By about mid-morning, we all realized that rather than being a world-class rugby team, the Boks were really world-class enablers of procrastination. The nation did nothing on the Monday after the France game but discuss the France game. When it became impossible to reflect sagely on Etzebeth's slapdown, what does one call it exactly, early on in the game, we discussed it some more. There were so many things to discuss after all. Was it an attempted intercept? Was it foul play? Did O'Keefe condone it because it was so early in the game? Or did he legitimately feel that the ball went backwards, so there was no need to intervene? Such discussions went on for as long as the endless second half of the night before, and we all know how long that endless second half was. Of course, the endless second half wasn't only endless, it was also the half which couldn't end quickly enough. Those final few minutes were agony, like torture. They shaved hours off my life. They shaved hours off the nation's life. In the radiant light of the television set, we all became older. At the end, I realized why boxing is no longer a sport that anyone takes seriously, because you get everything and more in an international rugby game. Towards the closing stages in 2 of the quarterfinals, the pace slowed. It slowed to walking pace. You saw it in the Ireland versus New Zealand game. Johnny Sexton, the 37-year-old Irish fly half, started out the game at a run. He was, you felt, pacing himself. Later he geared down to a sensible jog. By the time the Irish went through their mammoth 30 phases there at the end, Johnny was walking. He was out on his feet, just like a boxer would have been. Forget a substitute, he needed a walking stick or a walker. Johnny needed a Zimmer frame, which does raise questions about why he wasn't at least substituted, which, need we be reminded, would have allowed for a breather and a little sit down. There was walking in the Springboks quarter-final too. With the match over on the clock, they were still playing down on the field. Rida Wadi, the French substitute loosehead prop, received the ball as the French lumbered towards the distant Springbok try line. What did Wadi do? Partly in surprise, partly out of exhaustion, Wadi stopped. After stopping which lasted for an eternal fraction of a second that seemed to last longer than time itself, he started up again. What a stop it was. We stopped with him. Thing was, he started up again slowly because he was already exhausted. He had only been on the field for just over half an hour, replacing 2-try Cyril Bai in the 50th minute, but he was so tired he took a moment to move towards the green wall in front of him. It was the most gut-wrenchingly poignant moment of the match. We all want to see tries. That's understandable. That's what the highlights packages are made of, and that's what the punters dream about once they've fallen asleep. This was something else, something elemental, like watching a wounded warrior on the battlefield in an act of physical heroism that can only twist your insides. William Wordsworth, the romantic poet, was a lifelong walker, so he would warm to the walking theme. Quote, "Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility," William the Walker once wrote. In keeping with the spirit of the above quote, what Wadi gave us on Sunday night was poetry, prop poetry, or the poetry of props if you prefer. Other actors and other actions might lend themselves more easily to poetry, but Wadi's stop-start trundle into the Springbok half was rendered all the more pathos-filled by what happened next. De Klerk, in perhaps his best moment of the entire match, ripped the ball out of Wadi's tired arms. The ball bounced forwards. Colby picked it up and hoofed it into the stands, while Pollard fell over in delight. Etzebeth smiled, a first. We tried to smile but couldn't. We were too exhausted. Willie spoke to the referee and then thought better of it. "We love you, Willie. It's all okay, but you talk way too much. Not that we should blame you too much for talking this week, Willie. We've been talking a fair bit ourselves, because no one can do any work." Perhaps that should be, we can do no work, so we've whiled away the hours by talking. When we haven't been talking about France, we've been talking about England. England have the distinction of being the only side in the World Cup who haven't lost. The All Blacks lost to France, the French to South Africa, and South Africa lost to the Irish. The team we haven't yet mentioned, who are also in the semi-finals, are Argentina. They lost to England. England also lost to South Africa in the 2019 World Cup final in Japan. They've been smarting about it ever since. The game against them is unlikely to be another France, but it will be as dramatic and as passionate as Sunday night at the Stade de France. If you enjoyed this episode of The Luke Alfred Show, please like, share, follow and subscribe. I write full scripts for the show in the form of long-form essays, and these are all available on my Substack. To get written episodes of The Luke Alfred Show a day early on Fridays, please check out the Luke Alfred Substack. You can hear The Luke Alfred Show on YouTube, Spotify, Apple and Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. I release a new episode every Saturday at 10:30 a.m.,